The United States operates the largest air power apparatus that this world has ever seen, but in a 21st century fight against an industrial powerhouse like China, well, numbers are unlikely to be Uncle Sam's strong suit. Now, China is soon to have 5 different classes of fighters in active production, including 2 stealthy 5th-generation jets in the J-20 and J-35. Now, current assessments place the nation's combined annual fighter production numbers at more than 240 new jets per year, but China's maximum estimated capacity is believed to be more like 400. Now, the United States, on the other hand, is only taking deliveries from 2 fighter lines in the F-35 and F-15EX, totaling fewer than just 200 new fighters per year. But China isn't just building new fighters, it's also investing in converting old fighters, like their J-6s, J-7s, and J-8s, into simple combat drones capable of flooding Taiwan's airspace to saturate air defenses and come crashing down on stationary targets like massive cruise missiles. And that got me thinking, well, 2 could play at that game, right? After all, it's not like the US has a shortage of retired airframes gathering dust under the desert sun of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. So, what would it take to turn America's Boneyard fighters into 21st century combat drones? And maybe more importantly, would it be worth it? Let's see if we can't figure it out. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Alright, let's be honest, the cost of living isn't just high, it's pretty exhausting. And if you've been leaning on credit cards lately just to cover the basics like groceries, gas, or utility bills, well then you're basically paying a survival tax of 20% interest or more. Why keep handing your hard-earned paycheck to the big banks when you could keep it for you and your family? My friends at American Financing have a better way. They're helping homeowners tap into their equity to pay off high-interest debt with mortgage rates that are currently in the 5s. On average, American Financing is saving their customers about $800 a month. That's nearly $10,000 a year back in your pocket. Now, this service isn't just a loan, it's a total financial reset. It takes just 10 minutes to find out what you could save. There are no upfront fees, and there's no obligation to talk to a salary-based management consultant. And here's the kicker, start today and you could even delay 2 whole mortgage payments. American Financing is America's home for home loans. Call them at 866-889-8121. That's 866-889-8121, or go to americanfinancing.net/sandboxx with 2 X's. According to recent analysis from the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, China has already converted around 500 of its dated J-6 fighter aircraft into semi-autonomous combat drones and deployed some 200 of these aging jets to 6 different air bases positioned all around the Taiwan Strait. Now, these fighters are not what you'd call spring chickens. With a design that is based directly on the 2nd-generation MiG-19 that first entered service in 1955, China's J-6 reached duty in the early 1960s and continued to serve in that fighter role for nearly 6 decades, with production lines running all the way until 1986, and the last of these practically ancient designs not leaving active service until as late as 2010. That is correct. China's 2nd-gen fighters served for so long that they ultimately shared the sky with 3rd-gen, 4th-gen, and even 5th-gen jets before finally calling it quits. And for a brief 3 years, China's J-6s lounged in well-earned retirement. But in 2013, China kicked off a new initiative aimed at getting the best of these old jets back into the fight. Not in the same fighter role they once filled, but now as supersonic kamikaze drones that China can use to flood Taiwan's airspace and overwhelm local air defenses in the earliest stages of an invasion. In effect, China took 500 of its oldest fighters and turned them into very big cruise missiles, which I have to admit is a novel way to reuse airframes that you already have laying around. But if I'm totally honest, this approach just doesn't make the most economic sense to me. While China's already got the fighters, the costs associated with using their J6 fleet as kamikaze drones extend well beyond the initial price of conversion. As Yefim Gordon and Dmitry Komisarov wrote in their book that was aptly titled Chinese Aircraft, the J6 was built to serve as a practically disposable jet, with the goal of only reaching around 100 flight hours or 100 single-hour sorties before needing a complete overhaul. Now, these aircraft will certainly see far fewer flight hours in their new drone roles, but that doesn't change the fact that in order to function as drones, well, these aircraft need to continue to function as aircraft, and that isn't free. Of course, while the United States might disclose how much it spends every year maintaining its aircraft, China does nothing of the sort. So we can't say for sure how much it might cost to keep 500 aging jets in good working condition just in case you want to crash them into your neighbor someday. But logic dictates the costs are likely higher than maintaining 500 much smaller and still in production cruise missiles. Like all things defense, the important questions we should be asking when discussing costs and expenditures isn't always whether or not a platform can offer battlefield value, but rather whether or not the platform represents the best use of the limited budget you have to deliver battlefield value overall. Or, to put that another way, most platforms, regardless of age or capability, can be useful in a fight with appropriate and effective planning, but not all are economically logical. China could spend millions of dollars a year keeping 500 old fighter jets in good enough flying condition to reach Taiwan, or they could allocate those same millions toward further increasing their stockpiles of arguably more effective cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and cheaper modern drones. That is to say that China's approach to converting retired fighters into autonomous cruise missiles is creative and novel. But the longer these jets remain active in that role, the more China has to spend on keeping them flight-worthy and the less financial sense the whole concept ultimately makes. But that isn't to say there's no value in converting old fighters into new combat drones. China's J6 kamikaze drones may not offer a very good cost-benefit ratio because, well, they represent one-time use assets in a fight, no different from any other piece of ordnance. So in terms of cost per target struck, each J6 comes at the price of the drone's conversion, years worth of service, repairs, maintenance, and more just to soak up one interceptor or potentially reach one target. But if you were to take a fleet of retired fighters and equip them not to serve as kamikaze drones, or at least not only as kamikaze drones, and instead give them an autonomy package that lets them fly simple air-to-ground combat operations and then come home again, well, then you might just have come up with a very cost-effective way to increase air power mass independent of new production lines. But just so we're clear, it still would not be anything close to cheap. In a dire enough situation, when America's industrial base was already working at full steam to pump out modern combat aircraft and munitions, but the fight simply required more combat mass than could be fielded in those conventional ways, well, then maybe a fleet of converted fighter Frankendrones might just be what the doctor ordered, at least in the short term, while larger production lines can spin up. But in such a situation, it would still make a lot more sense to use the AI-enabled autonomy systems being developed for collaborative combat aircraft, or CCA drones, to turn these dusty old jets into full-on Boneyard bombers, or, fighters that are just really focused on air-to-ground operations. Now, the United States is no stranger to converting manned aircraft into uncrewed platforms in a variety of ways, dating back to some of the earliest days of powered flight. While the US tested early drones, like the Kettering Bug, as early as 1917, the first time an American aircraft built to carry people was converted into a drone came as early as the 30s, with the Navy's Curtiss N2C2 target drone, which could be controlled remotely from another nearby aircraft, giving Navy fighter pilots a very realistic target to hone their gunnery skills. And within just about a decade, the US made the leap to converting jet-powered fighters into drones with the QF-80 Shooting Star, a fully reusable, remotely controlled jet fighter used for air-to-air missile testing and the like. Now, these early fighters turned target drones served as a prototype of sorts for a long line of QF platforms to come, as both tactical aircraft and air-to-air weapons continued to mature. To date, the United States has converted more than 1,100 fighters of different generations into remotely piloted drones for this role. Now, in the 50s and 60s, F-86 Sabres were converted into remotely piloted QF-86s. Then, F-100 Super Sabres were converted into QF-100s, F-102 Delta Daggers, F-106 Delta Darts, and later F-4 Phantoms, until starting in 2015, the Air Force began taking deliveries of converted F-16 Fighting Falcons, now QF-16 remotely piloted target drones. Now, the process of converting an F-16 into a target drone isn't exactly straightforward. After inspections and necessary repairs are made, each aircraft must then go through an 8-cell, 5-month modification process that includes the removal of some components, slight structural changes, adding new flight computers, telemetry hardware, and the addition of some 3,000 new wires inside the fuselage. The Viper's M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon is removed, while a flight termination system, effectively a self-destruct function, is added in case control of the aircraft is lost. Now, the QF-16 is then controlled by an operator via the Gulf Range Drone Control System, or GRDCS, which is a data link and has a range of around 120 nautical miles, roughly 138 miles or 222 kilometers for those of us who aren't pirates. Now, the first 6 prototype QF-16 conversions were contracted in 2010 for $72 million, which shakes out to roughly $107.9 million in today's inflation rate, or a conversion price of just under $18 million per jet. However, subsequent production contracts awarded in 2014 and 2015, totaling $56.2 million for 48 QF-16 conversions, shakes out to about $77.49 million today, or just about $1.6 million per converted fighter, showing us just how dramatically costs decline after the conversion process is refined into a serial rate production, or rather, serial rate conversion process. Now, these converted QF-16s, once complete, are rated for a minimum of 300 flight hours, which might not sound like that much, but that's actually more than a full year of regular flight operations for just about any in-service piloted fighter in the US Air Force. Now, remarkably, that isn't actually all that far off from the reported cost of converting F-4 Phantoms into QF-4s back in the 90s, which was contracted to BAE Systems at an estimated price of $800,000 per conversion back then, or roughly $1.7 million per drone today. Now, these conversions are specific to that target drone role, and they do include some systems, like remote scoring sensors for simulated weapons, that could certainly be left out. But broadly speaking, these target drones could potentially fill a very similar cruise missile-like role to China's J-6s by using the upgraded autopilot functionality to close with pre-established coordinates. You could potentially even release a few weapons along the way, but it isn't clear how effectively you could target them. And while I have already pointed out that I don't believe this to be the most cost-effective use of retired airframes, now still might be a good time to consider airframe availability, and whether or not there even are enough fighters collecting dust in the Boneyard to have a reasonable battlefield effect. Now, for those who may not be familiar, the Boneyard, officially the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group's storage and maintenance facility, is a vast 2,600-acre expanse of desert in Tucson, Arizona, that could be thought of as something of a retirement home for American military aircraft. Known as the largest aircraft storage facility in the world, the Boneyard houses some 4,000 aircraft and roughly 6,650 aircraft engines, some inside enclosed hangars, but many sitting out in open fields, where the dry desert climate keeps things like rust and corrosion rather low. Each aircraft is carefully cleaned when they arrived and then taped off and sprayed with a corrosion-inhibiting sealant upon arrival. Engines are stored in engine cans that are filled with nitrogen to prevent oxygen-based corrosion of internal components. Now, these aircraft are, generally speaking, kept in pretty good condition for a variety of reasons. Roughly 80% become parts donors for aircraft of the same type that are still in service, something especially valuable for those that have been out of production for a long time, so parts can be pretty tough to come by. According to the Pentagon, some 10,000 parts worth about $500 million were sourced from the Boneyard and then provided to different branches in 2024 alone. But aircraft are actually refurbished at the Boneyard and returned to active service more often than you might think. In 2016, the Marine Corps resurrected 23 FA-18 Hornets from the Boneyard, all to return to active service. In 2019, the Air Force brought a Boneyard B-52 back out of retirement, and a pair of B-1B Lancer supersonic bombers have followed since. Other aircraft, like retired Army C-23 Sherpas, have been refurbished and transferred to other government agencies, like the U.S. Forest Service and others. Now, the Tucson Boneyard is not the only military aircraft storage site in the United States, but it is the largest by a huge margin. Most other facilities housing aircraft see a mix of commercial, military, and private platforms, retired or refurbished, like the Pinal County Air Park in Arizona, the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California, and the Southern California Logistics Airport, and a bunch of others. But public records of the exact type and number of aircraft housed in these locations are really tough to come by, so we will use the Boneyard's figures as our totals, just for the sake of argument, but we should understand that there are likely to be more fighters out there collecting dust than this final tally I'll give you in a bit will represent. So, after scouring the 77-page Boneyard aircraft inventory, I was able to drum up these totals for relatively modern combat aircraft that might be worth giving the drone treatment. 47 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, 52 F-4 Phantom IIs, 141 F-15s of varying sorts, 189 F-16s of all types, and my personal favorite, 8 F-14 Tomcats. Now that makes for a total of 437 potential drone fighter conversions, which it is worth noting is enough fighters for the Boneyard alone to qualify as the 5th largest fighter fleet on the planet, all by itself. Now, of course, a lot of these fighters are missing parts and may need new parts purchased from vendors or more serious restoration just to get back into good working order. According to Colonel Redalia Person, the 309th AMARG's commander, roughly 10 to 15% of the aircraft in the Boneyard can be quickly returned to service, while the rest would require more thorough restoration. If we attribute that figure to our drone fighter totals, that would shake out to between 43 and 65 fighters ready for the job more or less immediately, and between 372 and 394 jets that would need more robust repair work before that modification could begin. Now, if the goal were to convert all of these fighter platforms into kamikaze drones akin to China's J-6s, the cost of doing so probably wouldn't be all that far off from the cost of turning these jets into remotely piloted target drones. However, each aircraft would require its own approach, as each of these platforms is different in a myriad of ways, most prominent in this context being their flight control systems. The F-16 is the only jet of this bunch with full digital fly-by-wire controls. All American F-15s prior to the F-15EX use a hydromechanical control system. The A-10 uses a hydraulic system. The F-4 uses a hydraulically boosted mechanical control system, and the F-14 uses analog computer-assisted hydromechanical flight controls. And that means fielding a one-size-fits-all solution probably won't happen. And aircraft that haven't been converted into target drones before, those F-15s, A-10s, and F-14s, would see high conversion costs initially as the process was hashed out, before reduced conversion costs in subsequent batches, as we saw in that initial QF-16 contract. And heartbreakingly, that probably means it wouldn't be worth converting those 8 remaining Tomcats. Not only are they unlikely to be in good working condition at this point and are sure to need significant restoration, but there are simply too few of them to be worth that large initial investment in developing the conversion hardware. So let's do some very rough back of the envelope math here, and I want to emphasize that these are broad numbers and averages, not real specifics. Assuming 15% of these fighters across each platform can be made flight capable relatively easily, that would give us 7 A-10s to start with, 8 F-4s, 21 F-15s, and 28 F-16s. Now, we can already assess that each F-4 will cost around $1.7 million to convert, while each F-16 would cost roughly $1.6 million. But the A-10s and F-15s will need to go through prototyping first. Now, in such a large-scale effort, the Pentagon would likely emphasize the use of any components possible across different platforms to reduce overall costs, but using that original F-16 conversion contract as a general model, that means we should be looking at roughly $18 million per conversion for the first half dozen jets, followed by a steep reduction thereafter. Again, we're going to use those QF-16 numbers as our model. Altogether, that would add up to just over $300 million to turn around 64 jets into kamikaze drones, with the understanding that the remaining 373 aircraft would not need any more prototyping and could likely then be converted, after receiving the necessary repairs, at a total conversion cost of around $630 million. Now that brings us a conversion cost total of $930 million for around 430 fighter aircraft. But importantly, repairs to these aircraft to make them flight ready again could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars or more. Assuming a total program cost of around $1.5 billion, that would ultimately shake out to around $3.4 million invested per converted drone, putting these fighters-turned-cruise missiles at a pretty similar price point to high-end cruise missiles like Lockheed Martin's AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missile. And to my surprise, that's not all that bad. Of course, then you also have 437 additional fighters to maintain each year, which, as we've already discussed, does not come free and tends to be more expensive than maintaining weapons that were designed and built for storage. But if using second-gen J6s as cruise missiles isn't all that efficient in my opinion, well then, using fourth-gen air superiority titans like the F-15 Eagle for the job seems, well, downright disrespectful. So for an effort like this to actually get my seal of approval, these drone fighters would need to be good for a lot more than just crashing into stuff. They need to be able to engage targets all on their own, and then come back to be rearmed, refueled, and pushed back into the fight again. Each individual target struck improves the cost trade-off for these drone conversions. A drone that costs $3.4 million and hits one target represents a cost of, well, $3.4 million per target. But if it can accurately drop one $30,000 JDAM on its way to sacrificing itself on the second target, well, the cost per target struck drops to half that, plus the price of that bomb, or roughly $1.73 million per target. Drop 2 bombs and we're down to $1.2 million a target. And by the time you reach 10 2-bomb sorties with a drone before it gets shot down, the cost of the JDAMs it's dropping vastly exceed the platform cost per target at a combined total of $770,000 per target struck, or a bit more than half the price of a single JASSM cruise missile that can obviously only hit one target. But, and there is a very big but here, converting these fighters into true semi-autonomous UCAVs capable of taking simple orders from human operators and then executing those orders en masse is indeed possible, but it would invariably be a lot more expensive and potentially time-consuming. There is good news, though, and that comes in the form of Lockheed Martin and Sikorsky's Matrix artificial intelligence supported flight control suite. Now, we've discussed Matrix a few times on this channel before, including how Sikorsky reps showed me in real time how to control a Matrix-piloted UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that was flying over Virginia from where we were standing in Washington, D.C., with nothing more than a tablet. Sikorsky has been flying their AI-controlled Blackhawks since 2022, and in October of 2025, they unveiled their new S-70 UAS U-Hawk, which is an uncrewed Black Hawk drone. But one of the most interesting things about the Matrix Autonomy Suite that I learned in my conversations with their team is that the system itself is actually platform agnostic, meaning it could theoretically be integrated into just about any aircraft with existing fly-by-wire controls, like those 189 F-16s in the Boneyard. Then platforms without fly-by-wire controls aren't necessarily out of the running either, as the UH-60 Blackhawk actually lacks fly-by-wire capabilities itself. Sikorsky had to retrofit their prototype Blackhawk drone with fly-by-wire controls first, and then integrate that with Matrix. Then, of course, as you might expect, converting a bunch of old F-15s to, say, the more modern F-15EX's fly-by-wire control system would not come cheap, but at least there's already some notion out there about how to do it. Now, according to Lockheed CEO Jim Takelet, the full conversion process on a UH-60 Blackhawk rings in at around $5 million, which includes adding that fly-by-wire control. So chances are good that it would potentially be similar, but maybe even more, for a lot of those non-fly-by-wire jets baking in the Boneyard. At that price point, it would cost roughly $705 million to convert all 141 F-15s in our drone fleet after the costs of restoring them to flight-ready condition. And if we could somehow hold that same price point across all 437 fighters in the Boneyard, well, the conversion costs approach $2.2 billion, or what would likely be closer to $3 billion once you included repairs and restoration. Now that actually only shakes out to around $6.9 million per fighter turned combat drone, which notably is about a quarter of the price of a new MQ-9 Reaper. But here's where I've got to step in with a whole bunch of party-pooping disclaimers that really rob this concept of most of its fun. First and foremost, Sikorsky's Matrix Autonomy Suite may be touted as platform agnostic, but it has yet to actually make the leap to fighters and may ultimately prove poorly suited for the job. Now that may not be a deal breaker. After all, the US Air Force is already very literally building F-16 combat drones as we speak in Project Venom, short for Viper Experimentation Next Gen Operations Model. Now, this effort has already seen AI autonomy systems installed into one heavily modified F-16 that we call the X-62 Vista, and those systems are currently being installed in a half dozen real combat-coded F-16s for that autonomy software and AI piloting agents to continue to mature. Now, this program has seen AI-piloted F-16s fly real-world air combat exercises for going on 3 full years already. Now, these AI agents will ultimately be tasked with flying collaborative combat aircraft, or CCA drones, that are also in active development and testing as we speak. But the goal is also to stuff AI co-pilots into the cockpits of combat aircraft as well, helping to reduce the cognitive load on pilots and allowing them to place their focus on the fight rather than on the aircraft's basic operations. But both of these goals, and the F-16 testbeds currently being used, all serve as proof of concept for an AI-powered drone conversion on retired fighters. Of course, it is worth remembering that pulling old jets out of the scrap heap to fix up for the fight would come with all kinds of unforeseen challenges, and broadly speaking, converting these jets into drones probably doesn't make as much sense as just using those billions of dollars to purchase more low-cost cruise missiles, drones, and even tactical aircraft that are still in production. Heck, $3 billion would be enough to buy 15 F-35s and 50 MQ-9 Reapers, which could arguably accomplish more over their operational lifespans than 430 scrap heap fighter drones. If each rehabbed fighter drone offered a 300 flight-hour lifespan, that would provide the US military with around 131,100 operational flight hours. But each F-35 is rated for 8,000 flight hours, and each MQ-9 offers north of 20,000. So, in terms of flight hours alone, spending that money on F-35s and MQ-9s would net American forces nearly 10 times the operational hours of our hypothetical Boneyard fighter fleet. But again, it is so important to keep in mind how this comparison fails to come anywhere near truly encompassing the complexity of real-world operational planning. So, should the United States follow China's lead in converting its retired fighter aircraft into combat-capable drones? Broadly speaking, I would say no, not in our current circumstances anyway. With so many potentially budget-busting variables to manage, building cruise missiles would be way more cost-effective than converting these fighters into kamikaze drones, and investing into a wide variety of more modern collaborative combat aircraft or drone fighters would garner far more operational capability in the long run. But that, again, is in our current circumstances. If the US were to find itself in a large-scale fight against a nation like China, maintaining sufficient air combat mass or keeping enough airframes in the fight could become a real challenge in the face of heavy losses. As the defense industrial base shifted toward a more pronounced wartime footing, rushing some Boneyard drone fighters into service as a stopgap measure in the meantime, well, it might not be the most frugal option in the long term, but that cost wouldn't just be buying drones, it would importantly also be buying time. And with that, ends yet another edition of AirPower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxxnews.com and especially download our new Sandboxx News app, available now for iOS and coming soon for Android, to get all of the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.